Hello and welcome to the Revised Common Rule webinar series. This webinar is about revisions to informed consent. This webinar is presented by the CITI program. This presentation is based on the original CITI program final rule resource, Revisions to Consent, authored by Chadwick. My name is Margaret Rankovic and I will be your presenter today. I will be discussing the revisions to informed consent in this webinar. A quick overview. This presentation aims to review the revisions to informed consent from the pre-2018 version of the Common Rule to the 2018 version. Just note this presentation is for educational purposes only, and you should consult with your organization's policies and procedures as well as the applicable reviewing IRB for specific guidance for implementing the revised Common Rule. Audience, this is an advanced level topic. The webinar audience here is individuals already familiar with the Common Rule that are already familiar with those pre-2018 requirements, and they want to learn more about the most important changes to consent. The topics covered today include a review of major changes to the informed consent process. We're going to identify new basic and additional elements added to consent. We're going to discuss briefly the new broad consent process, also go over the new waiver criteria for documentation, as well as changes for general waiver and alteration of consent, and identify new consent form posting requirement. Just a quick note about terminology. When I say pre-2018 requirements, I'm referring to the pre-2018 rule, which may also be called the old rule, which may also be called the previous rule. The 2018 requirements, I'm going to call the 2018 rule, the 2018 requirements, or the revised rule. So pre-2018 is for research approved before 21 January 2019, and for the 2018 requirements is for research approved on or after 21 January 2019, or that was voluntarily transitioned to this new rule. So where is consent in these regulations? Consent is at 46.116, which covers the general requirements for informed consent. This is the consent process. And at 46.117, which is the documentation of informed consent. The 46.116 has the consent process requirements, and 46.117 has the documentation requirements. Informed consent is mentioned in other sections in the regulation, but those sections are mainly the IRB review of research and IRB criteria approval. The main section 111. So in 111 it states the approval criteria that in order for research to be approved, IRBs must determine that informed consent will be sought from each prospective subject or the subject's legally authorized representative in accordance with and to the extent required by 46.116, and also that informed consent will be appropriately documented or appropriately waived in accordance with 46.117. Now we're going to review the key revisions to the informed consent process found at 46.116a. The new process requirements include, let's review updates to the elements of informed consent at 46.116b and c. And just a quick review of how the regulation is set up here. So 116a, which I briefly touched on, that's the general requirements such as key information, concise presentation. 46.116b are the basic elements of informed consent, and those are those required elements such as description of risks and whom to contact with questions. 116c are called the additional elements of informed consent. 46.116c, this is the additional elements of informed consent, and this is a downshift of sections from 116b in the pre-2018 rule to 116c in the 2018 rule. There were no changes or revisions to the existing elements, but 3 new elements were added. Those elements were added at 7 through 9. So element number 7, a statement about the subject's biospecimens, if they'll be used for a commercial profit and whether the subject will or will not share in this commercial profit. What is broad consent? This is a new section at 116d with specific requirements. This can be used as an alternative to traditional informed consent. So what is it? Broad consent is a new type of informed consent pertaining to storage, maintenance, and secondary research with identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. Secondary research refers to research use of materials that are collected for either research studies distinct from the current secondary research proposal or for materials that are collected for non-research purposes such as materials that are left over from routine clinical diagnoses or treatments. Broad consent does not apply to primary research that collects information or biospecimens from individuals through direct interaction or intervention specifically for the purpose of the research. However, researchers could, so under the pre-2018 rule, the IRB could have a partial waiver that could alter or omit certain elements, any of the elements from informed consent. But under the 2018 rule, that 46116A section, which I said includes the understandable language, reasonable person, concise and focused presentation of key information, they're saying that is super important and it cannot be altered or omitted unless the IRB were to give a full waiver of consent. Elements that can be altered or omitted with that partial waiver would be 46116B, the basic elements of consent. So for example, you could omit the alternatives or confidentiality of records, and 46116, the additional elements of consent. 46116G is adding a new screening, recruiting, or determining eligibility potential. The previous requirement was that IRBs waive informed consent for screening, and this was viewed as burdensome. Now in 46116G, it allows an exception to the requirement of informed consent. This is not a waiver. In order to employ this, one of the two conditions must be met. The two conditions for the exception are: 1, the information will be obtained by communicating with the prospective subject, so you'll be asking them if you can do this, or 2, the information will be obtained by accessing records or stored biospecimens. Just a reminder, this is not a waiver of the consent requirement, but rather an... Now I'm going to discuss briefly the changes to 46117, consent forms, signatures, and waivers. So unlike 46116, which are the requirements for the consent process, 46117 are the requirements for consent documentation. Important changes include updates to electronic signatures, short form requirements, and an additional waiver of documentation. It's important to keep in mind that the revised Common Rule extensively updated the informed consent sections. However, there are still other regulations that impact consent. So for example, if a research study must comply with HHS and FDA regulations, they must comply with the HHS regulations, either the pre-2018 or 2018 requirements is applicable, and FDA when both sets apply. There is some limited guidance available about this, and the FDA has said that their harmonization is forthcoming. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, referred to as the GDPR, also has specific requirements for a data subject consent and data subject rights that would also affect the consent. So when HHS regulations apply and GDPR applies, you must make sure that you comply with all regulatory requirements. In conclusion, there are new process requirements. The big updates were to Section 46116, and they include revisions to the content, organization, and presentation of information. These changes are meant to increase protections for subjects and facilitate the prospective subject's decision whether to participate in the research or not. The revisions reflect a modernization and are aiming to reduce regulatory burden. For example, electronic informed consent, broad consent, new provision for screening, recruiting, or determining eligibility, and posting consent forms as an effort towards transparency. Additional resources. I would always recommend going back and reading the preamble for the revised rule because it offers explanation and insight about the revisions. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned about the changes to informed consent from the pre-2018 rule to the 2018 requirements. Thank you.